There are moments in history when a single life becomes a mirror, reflecting not what the world already knows, but what it has forgotten. In 1867, when the world worshipped science as the new god of certainty, a boy named Timothy Caldwell was born, a child who obeyed no law of biology, no logic of reason, and no explanation of man. He was not a prodigy, nor a prophet, but something far more unsettling, a living question. A question that echoed through every laboratory and pulpit alike. Can humanity truly explain what it has not yet understood about itself? In the year 1867, the world was standing on the proud shoulders of progress. The laboratories of Europe buzzed with the optimism of discovery. The steam engine had redefined movement, and science, clothed in the confidence of reason, was fast becoming the new religion of mankind. Yet, amid this age of certainty, a child was born, Timothy Caldwell, whose very existence seemed to mock the intellect of his time. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary boy in appearance, but his mind carried shadows that science could neither dissect nor define. He spoke of things unseen, heard voices no one else could perceive, and often drifted into states of vision where he described events that would later occur with uncanny precision. His condition defied every physician's logic and unsettled every theologian's faith. What frightened them was not simply that he was strange, but that he revealed the limits of their understanding. In him, they met something older than knowledge itself, the unknown, the ancient mystery that modernity had worked so hard to forget. The shadow of the unknown does not dwell in the stars or in the distant oceans. It resides within the human mind. In Timothy's story, one can sense the unease of an entire civilization confronted with the side of itself it had repressed. The scientists of his time, armed with instruments of measurement, could not tolerate the possibility that there might be truths beyond their reach. They sought to explain him as a medical anomaly, a defective brain producing hallucinations. Yet each attempt to reduce him to biology only deepened the sense of mystery. He would speak names of people he had never met, describe landscapes from places he had never been, and recount dreams that carried symbols far beyond a child's comprehension. He was not merely an enigma to the scientists, he was a mirror to their own blindness. For every era, in its arrogance, creates its own shadow, the dimension it denies because it does not fit within the prevailing logic of its time. Timothy became that shadow for the 19th century. In his presence, the so-called Age of Enlightenment was forced to confront the darkness it had exiled, the irrational, the mystical, the unseen. The doctors who studied him would leave his home at night disturbed and sleepless, not because they feared disease, but because they feared the collapse of their certainty. They had believed that science could explain everything, that reason was the final light. But the boy's calm, unexplainable gaze dismantled that illusion. He seemed to carry within him something older than time, something neither divine nor demonic, but profoundly human, the hidden depth of consciousness that defies categorization. His life became a living confrontation between light and shadow, knowledge and mystery. It is in such figures that humanity's collective fear of the unknown gathers form. For what we cannot explain, we often condemn. The townspeople whispered that Timothy was cursed or touched by forces unnatural. Others believed he was a prophet, born to reveal something the world was not ready to hear. Both reactions, the fear and the worship, were two sides of the same ignorance. They came from the inability to see that the boy was not a messenger of another world, but a reflection of this one. His condition was not proof of supernatural interference, but a manifestation of the depths within the human psyche that society refuses to explore. The shadow, when ignored, does not disappear. It returns in forms that terrify and fascinate us. In the quiet of the night, Timothy would sit by the window, murmuring words no one could understand. His mother described him as peaceful but distant, as though part of him lived in another dimension of thought. The doctors, with their notebooks and rational hypotheses, tried to label his state: epilepsy, trance disorder, hysteria. Yet the more they observed, the less they understood. Some reported that when he spoke, the room seemed to still, as if the air itself was listening. They documented strange coincidences: candles flickering without wind, clocks stopping when he entered, dreams shared by those who slept near him. Whether these accounts were exaggerations or not, they carried the weight of a deeper truth. Timothy Caldwell had become a symbol, a living metaphor for the confrontation between man's reason and his mystery. The shadow of the unknown that emerged through him was not evil nor miraculous. It was psychological. It was the unacknowledged realm of imagination, intuition, and dream that the scientific mind had banished to superstition. But the mind cannot be divided without consequence. When one part is denied, it returns through phenomena that seem alien. Timothy's visions and voices were the eruption of this forgotten inner world. He was not a monster nor a saint. He was a symptom, a sign that humanity's balance had tilted too far toward rationality, leaving the soul starved for wonder. The more society tried to define him, the more he eluded definition, because he was not meant to be understood in terms of measurement. He existed as a reminder that the unknown is not an enemy of progress, but its necessary counterpart. To face the unknown requires humility, the courage to admit that knowledge has boundaries. The people of 1867 did not possess that humility. They believed the universe was a machine and the mind a product of nerves and chemicals. To them, Timothy represented failure, the failure of the rational project to encompass the totality of existence. But perhaps his purpose was not to be explained at all. Perhaps he appeared to remind humanity that mystery is essential for meaning. The shadow he cast was not darkness, but depth. It invited those who looked upon him to descend into their own minds, to confront what reason alone cannot heal, the anxiety of not knowing, the fear of what lies beyond the grasp of logic. When history remembers him as the boy science couldn't explain, it is not merely recording a medical anomaly, it is confessing a deeper truth about the human condition. Every age encounters its own Timothy Caldwell, a figure who breaks the boundaries of explanation and demands that we look inward. For the unknown is not out there, it dwells within, waiting to be integrated, not solved. And until mankind learns to embrace its own shadow, there will always be mysteries that defy even the sharpest instruments of reason. Timothy Caldwell was born in a time when the human mind was divided between faith in reason and nostalgia for wonder. The 19th century had made knowledge its new god, but the soul, denied its language, began to speak in symbols. Timothy was one such symbol, a boy who, though small and frail, carried within him a light that frightened those who called themselves enlightened. His presence stirred something ancient, something that no microscope could reveal. When he spoke, it was as if a forgotten melody had returned, a sound that made those around him remember what they did not know they had lost. He represented the eternal archetype of the divine child, not in a religious sense, but in a psychological and spiritual one. He embodied that spark of renewal which appears whenever humanity's spirit becomes rigid and old. His life, though brief and strange, was not an anomaly to be diagnosed, but a revelation of what lies hidden beneath the surface of ordinary existence, the creative, innocent, and mysterious force that keeps the human story alive. From the earliest myths of civilization, there has always been the image of the wondrous child, born under strange circumstances, misunderstood by the world, and yet carrying within him or her the seeds of transformation. This pattern repeats across cultures because it speaks to something fundamental within the human soul, the hope for renewal, the emergence of purity in the midst of corruption. Timothy's story follows that timeless rhythm. His extraordinary mind, which spoke truths beyond his years, became a mirror to his age. He was not a product of his century's progress, but its antidote. The people who came to see him did not realize that their fascination was less about the boy and more about what he awakened within them. The dim awareness that life's greatest truths cannot be constructed, only revealed. The boy reminded them that the world of spirit is not gone. It simply hides behind the noise of intellect. He carried the innocence that confronts sophistication, the simplicity that disarms logic, and the purity that exposes decay. When physicians examined Timothy, they looked for irregularities in the body, but what they encountered was irregularity in the spirit. His calm, almost sacred presence unsettled them, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. In their sterile instruments, they saw precision, but in him, they saw meaning. He spoke of stars that sang, of rivers that remembered, of faces that appeared in dreams and later came to life. Whether these were hallucinations or insights mattered little. What mattered was that through him, the forgotten connection between the seen and the unseen had begun to reawaken. He represented the part of humanity that still believes there is life beyond calculation, that the soul, not the intellect, is the true organ of understanding. His existence was an affront to a world that had begun to mistake progress for wisdom. There is something eternal about the child who carries impossible knowledge. It is the same image that appears in mythologies across time. The infant Horus who survives chaos, the young Krishna who laughs in the face of danger, the Christ child who brings light into darkness. These stories are not about literal miracles. They are about the birth of consciousness in a world that has forgotten how to dream. Timothy Caldwell was such a dream reborn. The scientists who gathered around him believed they were studying a case. In truth, they were standing at the threshold of their own forgotten souls. The boy's words, his quiet and distant nature, his unexplainable foresight, all these were not symptoms of illness, but signs of an emerging wholeness. The divine child archetype appears when the world is ready to heal from its own cynicism, when intellect must rediscover imagination. He came as a symbol of balance, uniting the rational and the irrational, the measurable and the mystical, into a harmony that only innocence can sustain. Timothy's innocence was not ignorance. It was a purity of perception, unfiltered by the categories adults impose upon reality. He saw not as the mind sees, but as the heart remembers. In his presence, those who had spent their lives explaining things found themselves lost for words. Theologians wondered if he was touched by heaven, while skeptics dismissed him as delusional. Yet both missed the essence of his being. He existed not to confirm or deny belief, but to remind humanity of a deeper kind of knowing, the knowing that precedes knowledge. He was a living metaphor for the inner child that sleeps within every human soul, the part that believes without proof, creates without plan, and loves without reason. When society silences this child, life becomes mechanized, emotion becomes weakness, and mystery becomes error. But through Timothy, that silenced child spoke again, unsettling the complacency of an age that thought it understood itself. The boy's influence spread beyond his village. Reports of his visions and unexplainable insights reached the newspapers, inviting both curiosity and ridicule. Yet beneath the sensationalism lay a quiet transformation. Those who met him often described feeling changed, not in belief, but in being. They could not articulate it, but it was as if the walls of their minds had softened. He carried with him a quality of presence that transcended logic, a stillness that hinted at something sacred in the ordinary. In that stillness, people caught glimpses of their own forgotten wholeness. It was as though Timothy's silence spoke the language of the soul, reminding them that life's purpose is not merely to understand, but to become. He stood between the worlds of science and spirit, not belonging to either, yet healing both through his existence. The divine child archetype always brings renewal through contradiction. Timothy's frail body contained immense strength, his silence carried revelation, his unknowing revealed truth. He existed at the threshold where opposites unite, innocence and wisdom, vulnerability and power, human and transcendent. This paradox disturbed his observers because it defied classification. They wanted him to be either divine or diseased, gifted or mad, but he was neither. He was whole, and wholeness cannot be contained within categories. Through him, the world was invited to rediscover that true knowledge is born not from analysis, but from integration. The boy's mystery was not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be lived. To those who truly saw him, Timothy was not a spectacle, but a teacher. His life whispered that renewal does not come from invention, but from remembrance, from returning to the source within. His gaze, deep and unjudging, reminded others that beneath the layers of intellect and doubt lies a simplicity untouched by time. That simplicity is the divine child within every human being, the unbroken core of wonder that connects us to everything alive. The tragedy of Timothy Caldwell's story is not that science could not explain him, but that it tried to. For to explain what is sacred is to lose it. He came not to be studied, but to awaken, not to reveal the supernatural, but to restore the natural miracle of consciousness itself. In his existence, the world was offered a glimpse of what it once knew but had forgotten, that in every child lies the spark of eternity, and in that spark, the promise of renewal for the weary soul of humanity. The case of Timothy Caldwell in 1867 exposed a conflict that lay at the heart of human understanding, the tension between faith and empiricism. His existence placed the two great domains of thought face to face, and neither emerged unshaken. The scientists who came to observe him represented the triumph of a new order of reason. They carried their microscopes, thermometers, and notebooks as priests once carried relics. They sought measurable proof, visible evidence, something that could be weighed, recorded, and classified. To them, the universe was a vast mechanism, and the human mind merely a collection of nerves and reactions. Yet before Timothy, their instruments fell silent. His words, his visions, his strange intuition seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the reach of the physical. He spoke truths that could not be traced to sensory experience. He described illnesses before they occurred, recalled lives he had never lived, and seemed to move effortlessly between waking and dreaming. The more they examined him, the more he dissolved into mystery, and in that dissolution lay their defeat. They had entered his presence expecting to find an abnormality, but instead found an abyss, a depth within the human psyche that could not be charted. On the other side stood the ministers and the faithful, the guardians of spiritual interpretation. They saw in Timothy the possibility of divine intervention, a sign that heaven still whispered through chosen vessels. To them, he was not an anomaly but a message, perhaps even a miracle. Yet they too failed to see him clearly, for their desire to sanctify him was another form of control. They sought to name the divine, to capture it in doctrine, as the scientists sought to capture it in data. In their fear of ambiguity, both camps became mirror images of one another, one worshiping the body, the other the soul, both forgetting the unity that binds the two. Timothy stood between them, silent, neither belonging to faith nor to science, but reflecting the limitations of both. His quiet eyes seemed to ask the same question of everyone who approached him. What if truth is not divided? What if spirit and matter, faith and logic, are but two languages describing the same reality? The confrontation between faith and empiricism in Timothy's story was not merely intellectual, it was existential. It revealed the inner split within humanity itself. The 19th century had declared victory for reason, but in doing so, it had severed man from mystery. Faith had turned defensive, clinging to ritual as a shield against the cold light of science. Both sides feared what the boy represented, a reconciliation that would dissolve their boundaries. To the scientist, he was a threat to the certainty of measurement. To the priest, he was a challenge to the monopoly of revelation. His very existence suggested that there might be a middle ground where knowledge is both empirical and intuitive, where observation and reverence coexist. Yet neither side dared to enter that space, for it demanded humility. It required acknowledging that the mind's deepest truths are not discovered through domination, but through surrender. When the scholars questioned Timothy, they did so as though interrogating nature itself. They recorded his pulse, noted his speech patterns, and charted the changes in his pupils during his trances. But the more they measured, the less they understood. They found themselves haunted by the possibility that what they were witnessing was not an external phenomenon, but a reflection of their own fragmented worldview. The boy did not offer them evidence, he offered them a mirror. What they saw disturbed them, for if his mind could reach beyond the physical, then perhaps their understanding of the physical was incomplete. If his visions contained truth, then perhaps truth itself was not bound by experiment. He forced them to confront the arrogance of their assumptions, the belief that reality must submit to their methods or be dismissed as illusion. In the flicker of the boy's eyes, they saw the collapse of certainty. Those of faith, too, faced their reckoning. They were drawn to Timothy's apparent otherworldliness, but feared his unpredictability. He did not fit the pattern of a saint or prophet. His words were not proclamations of divine law, but poetic fragments, strange and symbolic. He spoke of the unity of all things, of how thought and matter were threads in the same fabric. Such notions unsettled the churchmen, for they blurred the line between creator and creation. To embrace him fully would have meant admitting that revelation might not be confined to scripture, but could also emerge from within the human soul. It would have meant acknowledging that faith too must evolve. And so, even as they blessed him, they tried to contain him within their doctrines. In doing so, they made the same mistake as the scientists. They tried to define what was meant to remain infinite. The confrontation surrounding Timothy was not a battle between belief and disbelief, but a struggle between two halves of a broken whole. Science had forgotten its origin in wonder, and faith had forgotten its foundation in truth-seeking. The boy's presence reminded both that the ultimate purpose of knowledge, whether religious or empirical, is not to dominate but to understand. He revealed that the sacred is not opposed to the rational, but that both arise from the same source, the human longing to make sense of existence. The child who saw beyond the senses was not defying science, he was expanding it. He was not rejecting faith, he was renewing it. His silence carried the wisdom that both camps had lost, that the universe cannot be grasped through analysis alone, nor worshipped through blind reverence. It must be lived, felt, and integrated within the soul. The physicians who dismissed him as delusional did so out of fear. For if he was real, if his experiences were genuine, then their entire structure of thought would collapse. The priests who declared him divine did so out of the same fear, for if he was only human, then divinity itself might be something internal, not external. In their reactions, one sees the same anxiety, the terror of ambiguity, the refusal to face the mystery within. Timothy Caldwell stood in that space of tension and became the living embodiment of paradox. He was not the victory of faith over reason, nor the triumph of reason over faith. He was the invitation to transcend both, to awaken to a dimension of knowing that includes but surpasses them. He represented the meeting point where the measurable and the ineffable become one. Had his observers possessed the courage to listen instead of label, they might have realized that Timothy was not a disruption of nature, but a revelation of its deeper order. His visions, his uncanny perception, his serene acceptance of the unexplainable, all these pointed toward a truth neither side could accept, that reality is not divided between the spiritual and the material, but united in consciousness. The child they studied as a mystery was, in truth, a mirror of the human condition. His story shows that every attempt to separate faith from reason creates conflict, and every effort to integrate them brings wholeness. The boy science could not explain was never meant to be explained. He was meant to be understood, not with the intellect alone, but with the totality of being. When Timothy Caldwell appeared in 1867, what frightened society most was not the boy's strange gifts, but what he represented. His existence forced people to look at the one thing they had long refused to face, their collective fear of the unnatural. Every society builds invisible walls around what it calls normal, safe, or real. Beyond those walls lies the territory of mystery, the realm of phenomena that cannot be measured or explained, the domain of intuition, madness, dreams, and the unspoken. Timothy came from that borderland. The stories that surrounded him, of voices, visions, and moments where time itself seemed to bend, did not fit into any known pattern of experience. Those who witnessed them could not name what they saw, so they called it unnatural. But what they feared was not something foreign to human nature. It was something deeply human that they had buried. The so-called unnatural in Timothy's story was not a violation of order, but the return of what civilization had exiled from its definition of order. His life became a mirror held up to an age that worshipped progress, yet trembled before mystery. An age that had replaced awe with analysis and reverence with doubt. In the small town where Timothy lived, people whispered about him long before the scholars arrived. Some said he brought misfortune, others said he could heal. Both were wrong and both were right. Fear transforms whatever it cannot grasp into an omen, and Timothy became that vessel. The villagers' reactions revealed an old pattern, the human tendency to turn mystery into myth and myth into danger. They saw in him the possibility that nature was not as stable as they believed, that beneath the surface of ordinary life ran forces beyond control. The sight of the boy, pale and distant yet strangely luminous, unsettled them because he embodied everything they had been taught to suppress: the unpredictable, the emotional, the invisible. They had built their sense of safety upon the illusion that the world was rational, but Timothy's presence cracked that illusion open. When the scientists arrived, bringing instruments and theories, they too were driven by fear, though theirs was hidden behind curiosity. To them, Timothy was a test of reason's dominion. If they could explain him, they would reassert control over the unknown. They measured his heartbeat, observed his sleep, and recorded his words as though cataloging the behavior of a specimen. Yet as the weeks passed, unease crept in. The instruments showed nothing abnormal, yet the phenomena persisted. They began to feel watched, as though their own certainties were dissolving under the boy's quiet gaze. The more they attempted to confine him within scientific language, the more they realized that what they were facing was not merely biological, but existential. He had become the embodiment of their unacknowledged limits. What frightened them was not that he contradicted science, but that he revealed its incompleteness. The so-called unnatural that they sought to eliminate was, in fact, the missing dimension of their understanding, the soul they had long ignored in their pursuit of fact. In every era, those who represent the unexplainable become scapegoats. Society channels its collective unease into them, declaring them either holy or cursed, but never human. Timothy bore this projection silently. He neither defended himself nor sought to perform miracles. He simply existed in a way that defied expectation. People accused him of harboring demonic energy because they could not bear the thought that the extraordinary might be natural. In their minds, anything beyond comprehension had to belong to another realm, heaven or hell. This dualistic thinking allowed them to preserve the illusion of order. One evening, a local physician who had studied Timothy for months wrote in his journal that the boy's eyes seemed to contain the reflection of something that was not in the room. That description, though meant as an observation, revealed more about the observer than the observed. What he saw in Timothy was not another world, but his own repressed imagination, projected outward. This is what the human mind often does when confronted with what it cannot categorize. It externalizes it as something alien, monstrous, or divine. The fear of the unnatural, therefore, is not the fear of the unknown world, but the fear of the unknown self. Timothy became a living representation of that mirror effect. His presence caused others to glimpse the depths they denied. For some, this produced awe; for others, panic. Both reactions arose from the same realization that life contains far more than logic can hold. Even the clergy, who should have been guardians of mystery, grew uneasy around him. They wanted to believe he was a vessel of grace, but his behavior did not conform to their expectations of holiness. He spoke with neither doctrine nor defiance, and that ambiguity was intolerable. They sought signs in Scripture to classify him, but he eluded both categories. To them, the greatest danger was not that he was evil, but that he was beyond moral classification altogether. Yet the truth was far subtler. Timothy's strangeness was not supernatural, but deeply psychological. It emerged from the same depths that give rise to art, dream, and intuition. But because society had no language for these inner realities, it cast them outward as superstition. Thus, the fear of the unnatural was the fear of the unseen within, the parts of human consciousness that reason refuses to acknowledge. One evening, a local physician who had studied Timothy for months wrote in his journal that the boy's eyes seemed to contain the reflection of something that was not in the room. That description, though meant as an observation, revealed more about the observer than the observed. What he saw in Timothy was not another world, but his own repressed imagination, projected outward. This is what the human mind often does when confronted with what it cannot categorize. It externalizes it as something alien, monstrous, or divine. The fear of the unnatural, therefore, is not the fear of the unknown world, but the fear of the unknown self. Timothy became a living representation of that mirror effect. His presence caused others to glimpse the depths they denied. For some, this produced awe; for others, panic. Both reactions arose from the same realization, that life contains far more than logic can hold. Even the clergy, who should have been guardians of mystery, grew uneasy around him. They wanted to believe he was a vessel of grace, but his behavior did not conform to their expectations of holiness. He spoke with neither doctrine nor defiance, and that ambiguity was intolerable. They sought signs in Scripture to classify him, but he eluded both categories. To them, the greatest danger was not that he was evil, but that he was beyond moral classification altogether. A child who defied both blessing and curse threatened the foundations of belief itself. If the divine could appear without church and the miraculous without prayer, then where did authority reside? Timothy's silence became an accusation, not against individuals, but against institutions built upon fear. In a world that demanded obedience to either science or faith, he stood as the third possibility, the reality of direct experience, unmediated by authority. The collective fear of the unnatural that surrounded Timothy was, in truth, a fear of transformation. To accept that his experiences were real, or even possible, would require society to expand its definition of reality. It would mean admitting that human perception is limited, that what we call the laws of nature might be only fragments of a larger order. Such a realization demands humility, and humility is always painful. People prefer the comfort of certainty to the freedom of mystery. Thus, instead of expanding, they contracted. They ridiculed him, confined him, and sought to reduce him to categories that kept their worldview intact. Yet suppression never erases mystery. It only forces it to return in darker forms. The more they resisted, the more the stories about Timothy spread, growing in intensity and strangeness. What Timothy revealed, without ever intending to, was the paradox of human fear. We long for the miraculous, yet tremble when it appears. We pray for signs, yet flee when they disrupt our order. The fear of the unnatural is not a rejection of the extraordinary. It is the defense mechanism of a mind unprepared for its own depth. Timothy's existence was not a violation of nature, but a revelation of its forgotten dimensions. Those who looked at him saw what they were capable of becoming if they dared to embrace the totality of their being. But to do so would require a descent into the unknown, a journey through the very darkness they had spent generations denying. Thus they called him unnatural, when in truth he was the most natural of all, for he lived in harmony with the unseen forces that flow through every human soul. The tragedy of his story lies not in his mystery, but in the world's refusal to learn from it. The boy science could not explain was not a challenge to reason, but a mirror to fear, a reminder that what we call unnatural is often the part of ourselves we have forgotten how to love. Timothy's existence was more than a question posed to the rational mind. It was a mirror held up to the nature of human consciousness itself. He was not defined by the laws of matter or the boundaries of intellect. He stood as a symbol of something that defies categorization, a living paradox where the physical and metaphysical intersected. The inability of science to explain him was not a failure of method, but a limitation of vision. It was a sign that the tools humanity had chosen to interpret reality were too narrow to encompass the vastness of being. His presence forced a confrontation between two realms, the measurable and the ineffable, and within that tension lay the essence of transcendence. He revealed that the human experience cannot be confined to systems of logic because it is, at its core, a mystery that unfolds through experience rather than dissection. In every age, there emerges a figure who embodies the threshold between the known and the unknown. Timothy was such a figure. His very silence spoke louder than the instruments that tried to analyze him. Those who came to study him often left disoriented, not because they had failed to find an answer, but because they realized the question itself had changed. He represented the point where human knowledge meets its own shadow, the place where reason must surrender to awe. His unexplainable nature was not a defect in the human understanding of biology or psychology. It was the living expression of the truth that transcendence begins where knowledge ends. Through him, the world was reminded that to be human is not to conquer mystery, but to dwell within it. The longing to explain everything is itself an act of resistance against the vastness of life, an attempt to make the infinite small enough to be controlled. Timothy's mystery shattered that illusion. His being suggested that transcendence is not about escaping reality, but expanding one's capacity to perceive it. He was not beyond nature. He was nature in its most awakened form, aware of itself, conscious of its own unity. What unsettled people most about Timothy was not his difference, but his stillness. He did not strive to prove or to defend himself. He simply was, fully and unshaken. In his quiet presence, others felt their own restlessness exposed, the endless need to define, to measure, to explain. He seemed to exist in a state beyond duality, beyond the conflict between spirit and matter, faith and science, reason and emotion. To witness such wholeness was to confront one's own fragmentation. His transcendence did not lie in supernatural powers, but in the complete harmony between his inner and outer worlds. He was transparent to existence, allowing it to move through him without resistance. In this sense, he was not a miracle that violated natural law. He was a deeper revelation of natural law itself, the kind that cannot be captured by equations but only live through consciousness. The scientists who sought to understand him stood before a mystery that was not external but internal. Their instruments could measure his heartbeat, but not the rhythm of his being. They could observe his eyes, but not the awareness behind them. Timothy was the limit of their language, the point at which words failed and silence began to speak. There is a moment in human development when the individual must choose between remaining within the boundaries of inherited knowledge or stepping into the vastness of the unknown. Timothy's life was that moment, lived continuously. He did not resist the unknowable. He became one with it. His existence pointed to a truth that humanity has long feared, that consciousness is not confined to the brain but woven into the fabric of existence itself. His awareness seemed to flow beyond his body, touching others, connecting thoughts and emotions across distances that no physical law could explain. This was not telepathy in the crude sense of supernatural communication. It was the natural expression of a deeper unity that science had not yet learned to recognize. He embodied the idea that all beings share a single field of awareness, and that individuality is merely a temporary form within a greater totality. This was transcendence not as escape, but as realization. In his presence, the illusion of separateness dissolved, and those who came near him often felt both terrified and liberated, as though standing before the truth of their own infinite nature. The 19th century, the time of Timothy's birth, was an age obsessed with boundaries, the division between the natural and supernatural, sanity and madness, knowledge and superstition. Yet Timothy blurred all these distinctions. He was not sick, yet he was not normal. He was not holy, yet he was not ordinary. He existed in a liminal state, a space between definitions, where opposites merged and new meanings emerged. This in-between nature was the essence of transcendence, the realization that truth is not found in one pole of existence, but in the tension between them. His life was a continuous act of balance between form and formlessness. He lived in the world but was not of it, connected yet detached, visible yet elusive. His transcendence exposed the flaw of a civilization that sought certainty in everything. It revealed that the human need for explanation often masks a deeper fear of mystery. In his quiet defiance of categorization, Timothy taught that the highest form of knowledge is not mastery, but surrender, the ability to let reality be as it is, without the compulsion to dissect it. The transcendence Timothy embodied was not reserved for the chosen few. It was the latent potential within every human being, the ability to awaken from the dream of separateness and remember one's unity with the cosmos. He was not a supernatural anomaly, but a natural expression of evolution's hidden purpose, the expansion of consciousness. His difference from others was not in what he possessed, but in what he had relinquished. He had shed the layers of ego and illusion that bind most people to fear and conflict. What remained was pure awareness, unburdened by self-image, untouched by time. Those who encountered him often described a feeling of being seen, not judged, not analyzed, but seen as if their soul had been acknowledged for the first time. That was his power. It was not the ability to perform miracles, but the power to awaken recognition, the recognition that the divine is not elsewhere, but within. Timothy's life was a living reminder that transcendence is not about rising above humanity, but realizing its full depth. In the silence that surrounded Timothy, there was an invitation, not to believe, but to perceive. The scientists who failed to explain him were not wrong in their pursuit. They were merely looking in the wrong direction. They searched for causes in matter when the cause was consciousness itself. They tried to map the external while the truth lay within. The mystery of Timothy Caldwell could never be solved because it was not a problem, but a reflection of the human condition. He was the mirror in which humanity could see its own potential for transcendence, the point where science, spirituality, and psychology converge into a single truth, that the essence of being cannot be understood through separation, but only through unity. The boy science could not explain was not a riddle to be answered. He was the threshold humanity must cross if it wishes to truly know itself. He was the symbol of a truth older than time, that the greatest discovery is not in the stars, nor in the atom, but in the silent infinity that lives within the human soul. Timothy Caldwell's story is not merely the tale of a mysterious boy lost to the pages of 19th century wonder. It is the reflection of humanity's eternal struggle between knowledge and meaning, between what we can prove and what we can only feel. Science looked at him and saw a puzzle, yet what he revealed was not a flaw in reason, but a blindness in perception. He stood as a bridge between worlds, between the measurable and the immeasurable, the known and the unknowable. Through his silence, he reminded humanity that progress without soul is an empty pursuit, and that the greatest frontiers lie not in the stars or the laboratory, but in the depths of human consciousness. In him, the universe whispered its oldest truth, that we are not machines of matter, but vessels of mystery. Timothy's existence defied explanation not because he was beyond science, but because he was beyond limitation. He was the voice of the forgotten self, the mirror of the hidden divine, and the proof that the human spirit is larger than any system that seeks to contain it. The boy science could not explain was, in truth, the part of humanity that still waits to be remembered, the silent, infinite, and sacred depth within every soul.